She was on her knees, not in prayer, not in grief, in handcuffs. Her uniform, pale blue, pressed that morning with the same care she pressed everything, was twisted at the collar where someone had grabbed her. Her hands were clasped behind her back. Her eyes were fixed on the marble floor beneath her, not because she was ashamed, but because if she looked up, if she looked at him, she would fall apart. And she had promised herself she would not fall apart. Not here, not in front of him. The man standing across the grand foyer was tall, immaculate, and trembling, though not with sorrow, with fury. His jaw was locked so tight the muscles in his face moved like cables beneath his skin. 2 officers flanked him. A third spoke quietly into a radio. Somewhere deep inside the estate, a little boy's bedroom sat empty, his stuffed elephant still propped against the pillow. "You took him." The man's voice was barely above a whisper, which somehow made it worse. "You took my son." She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Mr. Hurst." "Don't," he stepped forward. One of the officers placed a hand on his arm. "Don't say my name, don't say anything, you are done here, you are done." And so she stayed silent. Kneeling on the cold marble of a home she had served faithfully for 2 years. In front of a man who, just that morning, had handed her a cup of coffee and thanked her for being so good to his boy. There was a camera in the garden. He had forgotten about it. She had no idea it existed. But the truth always finds a way. It always does. Her name was Simone Carter. She was 34 years old, the daughter of a school teacher from a quiet town in Georgia, and she had spent the better part of a decade caring for other people's children with a devotion that most parents barely manage to give their own. She had no husband, no children of her own yet, but she had Theo. Theodore Callum Hurst, 6 years old, gap-toothed smile, a laugh that started somewhere in his belly and shook his whole little body before it came out. He collected smooth river stones and kept them in a glass jar on his windowsill. He named every bird he saw in the garden. He called Simone Moni because at age 3 he could not quite reach the full word, and somehow the shortened version had stuck, had become sacred between them. Simone had come to the Hurst estate on a gray January morning 2 years prior, referred through a private placement agency that served only the wealthiest families in the Northeast. She had 3 references, a background check so clean it was almost boring, and the quiet confidence of a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. Callum Hurst had interviewed her in a room that cost more to furnish than most people earned in a decade. He was not unkind during the interview. He was simply precise. He asked questions like a man who had already decided the answer and was only listening to confirm it. He asked about her methods of discipline, her sleep schedule, her policy on screen time, her approach to emotional regulation in young children. She answered each question without flinching. At the end he had stood, offered his hand, and said only, "My son needs stability. Can you be stable?" She had looked him directly in the eye and said, "That is the one thing I have always been." She got the job. And for a time, for a long, golden time, it was everything she could have hoped it to be. Theo had been a grieving child when Simone arrived. His parents' marriage had begun fracturing the previous year, and though they had tried to shelter him from the worst of it, children always know. They feel the cold in a house long before the adults admit there is a draft. Theo had stopped eating much. He had started waking at 2 a.m., padding down the hall to knock on his father's door, and when Callum, exhausted, distracted, drowning in board meetings and legal consultations, would answer, Theo would simply stand there and say, "I just wanted to make sure you were still here." Simone learned about this on her 3rd night. She heard the small knock from her room down the hall. She heard Callum's heavy sigh. She heard nothing else. On the 4th night, she was already in the hall when Theo knocked. She sat with him on the floor outside his father's door, her back against the wall, his head on her shoulder, and she told him stories. Not fairy tales, real stories, about her own mother who used to hum while cooking, about a dog she'd loved as a child named Chester, about how sometimes the house is quiet not because something is wrong, but because everyone inside it is just resting. By the fifth night, Theo knocked on her door instead. And by the end of her first month, he was sleeping through until morning. Callum noticed. Of course he noticed. He was a man who noticed everything. It was what had made him dangerous in boardrooms and devastating in courtrooms. One morning, he had appeared in the kitchen doorway while Simone and Theo were making pancakes, Theo standing on a step stool, flour on his nose, narrating each step with the seriousness of a chef, and Callum had stood there for almost a full minute before either of them saw him. When Theo finally looked up and said, "Daddy, Moni says if you flip it before the bubbles come it turns into a disaster," Callum had laughed. A real laugh. Simone had not heard him laugh before that morning. "She's right," he'd said. "She usually is." It was the closest thing to a compliment she had ever received from him. She had kept it. The months that followed were a rhythm she fell into gratefully. School runs and homework, museum trips on Saturdays, bedtime routines that involved exactly 3 chapters, 1 glass of water, and a discussion about whatever Theo had observed in the garden that day. She documented everything in a small notebook, his fears, his breakthroughs, his favorite phrases. She shared the notebook with Callum once a week at a standing Friday check-in. He read it carefully, every word. She noticed he kept the notebooks in the top drawer of his desk. And then Petra came back. Petra Hurst, born Petra Wyndham, formerly of Boston, currently of wherever was most inconvenient, had been absent from the estate for 11 months by the time she reappeared. The divorce proceedings had been proceeding in a cold, efficient silence. Callum had a team of lawyers. Petra had a team of lawyers. Between them, Theo had been used as a currency neither of them was willing to admit they were spending. The first time Simone saw Petra, it was through the kitchen window. Petra had arrived unannounced on a Thursday afternoon, clicking across the gravel driveway in heels that cost more than Simone's monthly salary, wearing sunglasses even though it was overcast, with a man Simone did not recognize trailing behind her carrying a tote bag. Theo, who had been drawing at the kitchen table, looked up at the sound of the car. He went very still, then he went back to his drawing. "Is that your mum?" Simone asked gently. "Yes," he said, and drew a cloud over his son. The man with the tote bag was Conrad Webb, Callum's personal assistant, technically, but Conrad had been spending a great deal of time with Petra in recent months. "Errands," she said. "Administrative," Conrad said. Callum, who trusted Conrad completely and had for years, didn't ask questions he wasn't prepared to have answered. Conrad was 30 years old, neat, unreadable, and extremely good at being invisible in any room. The kind of man who filled glasses before they were empty and left conversations before they became arguments. He had worked for Callum for 4 years. He knew the estate's systems, its codes, its rhythms, better than almost anyone. He also knew where every camera was. Or rather, he thought he did. Petra's visit lasted 2 hours. She had tea with Theo in the sitting room while Simone waited in the kitchen, close enough to hear without intruding. The conversation was short on warmth and long on performance. Petra brought a toy, a robot that transformed into a car, which Theo examined politely and then set aside. When she left, she kissed his forehead. He stood perfectly still and waited for her to be gone. That evening, Callum arrived home late and came, as he sometimes did, to Theo's doorway to check on him. The boy was already asleep. Simone was straightening the shelf. "How did it go?" Callum asked quietly. Simone chose her words with great care. "He was calm throughout. He's asleep now, which is a good sign." Callum looked at his son for a long moment. "She's pushing for primary custody, full relocation." Simone said nothing. It was not her place. "Her lawyers are saying the environment here is unstable," he exhaled. "That he's too attached to people who aren't family." The word hung between them. "I understand," Simone said. She did not understand, but she knew how to hold things that were not hers to fix. The following week, Callum called her into his study. He was standing at the window, his back to her, his hands behind him. The posture of a man preparing to deliver something he had not yet made peace with. "I need to talk to you about the end of your contract," he said. She had half expected it. That did not make it land any softer. "My attorneys think it would be best if Theo's primary caregiver transitioned before the custody evaluation, to show that his environment is more structured around family. It's nothing to do with your performance. The notebooks," he stopped, started again. "You've been extraordinary with him." "When?" she asked. "End of the month. 12 days. She nodded. She did not cry. She said, "I would like to tell him myself if that's all right, in the right way, at the right time." Callum turned then, and for a moment something crossed his face that she could not name, not guilt exactly. Something older, something that knew it was making a mistake but had already committed. "Yes," he said, "of course." She left his study. She walked down the hall to the garden door, stepped outside into the cold air, and stood with her hands at her sides and her face tilted up toward the sky. She breathed in. She breathed out. She did not fall apart. She had 11 days left with Theo. She intended to make each one count. On the 8th day, a Wednesday, the estate was quieter than usual. Callum was in the city for a board meeting. Conrad had driven him in that morning and was due back by noon. Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, had gone to her appointment in town. The ground staff worked at the far end of the property, invisible beyond the tree line. Simon and Theo spent the morning in the garden. He had found a new bird, a cedar waxwing, brilliant and strange, and insisted on sitting perfectly still for 40 minutes in case it returned. It did. He whispered its description into Simon's ear like a secret. At 11:45 a.m., she brought him inside for lunch. She asked him to wash his hands and went to the kitchen to begin preparing his meal, a toasted cheese sandwich, cut diagonally, no crusts, with apple slices arranged in a fan because he liked the pattern. She heard the back door open and close. She assumed it was Theo, wandering back out to check on the bird. She finished the sandwich, arranged the apple slices, called his name. No answer. She walked to the hallway. "Theo." Silence. She checked the bathroom, his room, the sitting room, the playroom, the library where he sometimes hid behind the armchair when he wanted quiet. Empty, 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 empty. She went back outside. "Theo." Her voice was still measured, still in control. "Theo, lunch is ready." The garden stared back at her. The cedar waxwing's branch was empty. And something cold, not the air, but something deeper, something animal, moved through Simon Carter's chest. She ran. And before this story takes its next turn, I want to pause here for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. You have found yourself on Nanny Grace Channel, a place where the stories hidden behind wealth, power, and closed doors are finally brought into the light. Stories of betrayal, of broken trust, of love twisted into something unrecognizable. Stories that will leave you breathless. And if you have been here before, welcome back. You already know what this place means. To every soul listening right now, if this story is stirring something inside you, if it feels a little too real, a little too familiar, then you belong here. Hit that subscribe button, not because I am asking, but because you deserve to never miss what comes next. Now, let us get back to the story, because trust me, it is about to get so much deeper. Callum's phone rang at 12:19 p.m. He was in a glass-walled conference room on the 27th floor of his company's building, mid-presentation, when his personal line, the one only a handful of people had, lit up with the estate's landline number. He excused himself. It was the grounds supervisor, voice tight and formal, saying that there had been an incident, that the boy could not be located, that the nanny had been the last person with him. The word nanny landed in Callum's chest like a stone through glass. He was in his car within 4 minutes. He called Conrad, who was already on the road back. He called estate security. He called the police. What he did not do in those first terrible minutes was ask what had actually happened. He had already decided. It was a decision built from many smaller ones. The timing of Theo's disappearance 8 days before Simon's contract ended. The fact that Simon had been the only adult in the house. Petra's voice in the back of his mind, sharp and insistent from their last phone argument. She has too much influence over him, Callum. She is not his mother. She resents being let go. Watch her. He had dismissed it when Petra said it. Now, hurtling down the highway at 90 miles an hour with his hands white-knuckled on the wheel, it felt like prophecy. When he arrived at the estate, 2 police vehicles were already there. Simone was in the foyer. She was not hiding. She was not panicked. She was standing with her hands folded in front of her, speaking quietly to an officer, her voice steady and specific. The time she'd last seen Theo, the direction he'd been facing, what he was wearing, the sound of the door, every detail she could offer. She had already mapped out the search parameters on a notepad she'd found in the kitchen. Callum walked in and looked at her as though he had never seen her before. "Where is my son?" "I don't know," she said. "I have told the officers everything I—" "Where is my son?" louder this time. The officer stepped slightly between them. "Sir, we are currently—" She took him. Callum's voice dropped to that register, quiet, certain, devastating. She knew she was being let go. "She took my son." Simone's face went very still. "Callum," she used his name without his title for the first and only time. "I did not take Theo. I have been searching this property for the last 45 minutes. I called the police myself. I am trying to—" "Don't," he pointed at the officer, "detain her." The word detain fell into the room like something heavy dropped from a height. The officer hesitated. Professionally, there was no grounds for it yet. But Callum Hurst was a man whose phone calls were returned by mayors, and the officer was aware of this in the way that people in certain rooms are always aware of certain things. Simone did not resist. She did not argue. She looked at the officer and extended her hands. "I will cooperate with anything you need," she said, "because I have nothing to hide." They guided her to a chair. Someone produced handcuffs, a decision made out of anxiety rather than protocol, and she let them be applied without a word. And Callum stood in the center of his grand marble foyer and watched a woman who had spent 2 years loving his son be treated like a criminal. He felt certain he was right. That is the most dangerous kind of certainty, the kind that feels like justice. The next 3 hours were a specific kind of hell. Simone sat in that chair while the estate was searched. She answered every question put to her with precision and patience. She did not cry. She did not shout. She asked twice, in a voice that did not waver, whether anyone had checked the east side of the property near the old gardener's cottage, a route she had noticed Conrad taking on more than one occasion when he thought no one was watching. No one listened. Conrad had arrived back at the estate at 12:40. He had walked in with the quiet efficiency of a man returning from an ordinary errand, expressed measured concern at the scene, and immediately positioned himself at Callum's shoulder, where he always was when Callum needed steadying. "She was the only one here," Conrad said when Callum looked at him for confirmation. "I left at 7 this morning. The housekeeper left at 10. It was just her and Theo." Callum nodded slowly. Conrad had said it with such calm, such regret, like a man grieving a betrayal he had not wanted to believe in. He was very good at this. He had been practicing. The story that was beginning to circulate through the officers, through the estate staff who returned one by one to find the driveway full of police vehicles, was the story of a dismissed nanny who had taken a child in an act of calculated revenge. It had the terrible logic of things that feel true without being true. It had motive. It had timing. It had the weight of Callum Hurst's certainty behind it. By 2 p.m., One of the officers had made a call that sent the story beyond the gates of the estate. By 3 p.m., Simone Carter's name was being typed into news alerts. By 3:30 p.m., her photograph, pulled from a background check database, blurred slightly but recognizable, appeared on a local news site beneath the headline, Nanny detained in connection with billionaire heir disappearance. She did not know this. She was still in the chair, still answering questions, still, in the brief silences between questions, closing her eyes and praying not for herself but for Theo. Wherever he was, whatever had happened, let him be safe. Callum, meanwhile, had moved to his study. He was on the phone with his lead attorney, then with Petra, who answered on the second ring and said, in a voice that was too measured to be spontaneous, "Oh God, oh Callum, I knew something wasn't right about her." Then with his head of private security, then with a detective who specialized in high-net-worth disappearances. Detective Reyes, 50s, silver-haired, the kind of tired that comes from seeing too many cases that should have been simple. He arrived at 4 o'clock, walked through the estate with the thoroughness of a man who had not decided anything yet, and made his way eventually to the security office on the ground floor. A room Callum rarely entered, managed primarily by his head of security with Conrad's administrative oversight. The main camera system showed a gap, a 38-minute window beginning at 11:47 a.m., where the estate's primary interior and exterior cameras had gone offline. "System glitch," Conrad offered from the doorway. "It's happened before. I flagged it in the maintenance log last month." Detective Reyes looked at the log, found the entry, written in Conrad's precise hand. "Convenient timing," the detective said mildly. "Unfortunate timing," Conrad agreed. The detective studied the equipment with the patience of a man who was still listening for something no one had said yet. He walked the perimeter of the room slowly. He stopped at a shelf near the east-facing window, moved a stack of binders, looked at the small router-sized unit behind them, not part of the main security panel, older, dusty, clearly installed by a different hand at a different time. "What's this?" Conrad frowned. "Part of the old system, I'd imagine. Most of it was replaced 2 years ago." Detective Reyes picked it up and turned it over in his hands. Then he found the serial number, ran it against the estate's equipment registry, and stopped. The unit was not from the old system. It had been registered 14 months ago, under Callum Hurst's private account. Not the estate account, his private account. A secondary camera, motion-activated, independent power source, not connected to the main network, not documented in the staff systems, not on any layout that Conrad had ever been shown. Callum had installed it after a trespassing incident the previous winter. He had done it quietly, privately, the way men who have been burned before add locks to rooms they care about most. He had forgotten about it entirely. It covered one angle, a narrow corridor of garden, the east path, the gardener's cottage gate, and the rear vehicle access. Exactly the route Simone had mentioned. Detective Reyes excused himself from the room, walked calmly to the corridor, and called Callum's cell. "Mr. Hurst," he said, "I need you to come to the security room, right now, and I need you to bring whatever device accesses your private equipment account." There was a pause. "Why?" "Because," the detective said, "I think you have footage." The footage loaded slowly. The file was 41 minutes long. Callum sat in the chair in front of the monitor with his hands flat on the desk, like a man bracing for impact. Detective Reyes stood beside him. Conrad, who had followed Callum down the corridor, stood in the doorway with the stillness of someone who has just realized, too late, that the room he has walked into has no exits. The detective pressed play. 11:46 a.m. The garden path, gray-lit, empty. A bird, possibly a cedar waxwing, landed briefly on the gate post, then left. 11:49 a.m. A figure appeared from the main camera's blind spot, the north side of the garden behind the ornamental hedge. The figure was adult, male, neat, moving quickly but not running. He was holding something, a phone, raised slightly as if checking a message or timing something. He stopped near the gardener's cottage gate. He bent slightly, and then a smaller figure appeared beside him, having been led by the hand from off-camera. Theo. Small, confused-looking, glancing back once over his shoulder, but walking. Willingly, it seemed, the way a child walks when someone they know and have no reason to distrust says, "Come this way." Callum made a sound. It wasn't a word. The adult male opened the cottage gate, guided Theo through, and followed him. The gate closed. 11:53 a.m. The garden path was empty again. 11:58 a.m. A second figure entered the frame, moving fast, arms reaching forward then falling, reaching again. A woman's silhouette unmistakably in pale blue. Simone. Running, not walking, not drifting, running. Her mouth was open. She was calling his name. The footage had no audio, but the shape of the word was plain in her face, in the desperate forward lean of her body. Moni, who always kept her voice even and her hands steady, was sprinting through the garden with her arms outstretched and her face crumpled with a fear so pure and uncontrolled that it was impossible to look at it and still believe she had done anything except what she appeared to be doing. Searching for him. She ran to the cottage gate, tried it, locked from the inside. She ran back toward the house. She disappeared from frame. The footage continued. The garden was still. Callum had not moved. He appeared to have stopped breathing. Detective Ray's rewound to 11:49, zoomed in on the adult male. The face was partially turned, but the jacket was clear. The posture was clear, the phone in the right hand. Callum turned slowly in his chair. He looked at the doorway. Conrad Webb was gone. He had not run. He was too careful for that. He had simply ceased to be in the room, the way water ceases to be in a glass that has been tipped too far. Detective Ray's was already on his radio. Conrad was found 20 minutes later at the edge of the property, beside a vehicle that was not his. Inside the vehicle was a woman in sunglasses who had arrived. The gate log confirmed, at 11:41 a.m. and had been permitted through by Conrad, who had remote access to the estate gate from the administrator panel on his phone. Petra Hurst. Theo was in the back seat of the vehicle, asleep with his head against the window, his stuffed elephant pressed to his chest. Someone had brought it from the house. He had not been harmed. He had been given juice. He had been told they were going somewhere fun and that Daddy knew about it. He woke up when the detective opened the door and asked, very gently, if he was okay. "I want Moni," was the first thing he said. Petra and Conrad were taken into custody at 4:58 p.m. In the subsequent investigation, swift, thorough, and damning, a chain of encrypted messages was recovered from Conrad's phone. They detailed a plan conceived over 6 weeks, to use Theo's disappearance as a controlled event, timed to coincide with Simone's notice period, to frame a dismissed employee with motive and manufacture evidence of instability in Callum's household. The goal was twofold: to destroy Callum's custody case, and to leverage the resulting scandal into a settlement offer Callum would be desperate to accept. It was a plan built on one assumption, that no one had seen anything. It was a plan ended by a camera the size of a paperback book, installed by a cautious man who had forgotten it was there. Callum found Simone in the main foyer, sitting in the same chair they had placed her in hours before. She had not been told what the footage contained. An officer was in the process of explaining that she was free to go. She was listening with the composure of a woman who had been holding herself together by force of will alone for 4.5 hours, and the composure was beginning, very quietly, to fracture. When she saw Callum in the doorway, she stood. He crossed the room, stopped in front of her. He was a man who had built his entire adult life on precision, on knowing, on deciding, on being right. And he had never in his life been so completely, catastrophically wrong about anything. He did not offer a speech. He did not produce an explanation. He was not the kind of man who cried easily, but his eyes were doing something complicated that had nothing to do with ease. "Theo is safe," he said. "He is asking for you." Something moved through Simone's face, not forgiveness, not yet. Something more immediate. Relief so overwhelming it briefly took her legs from her, and she pressed one hand to the back of the chair to steady herself. "Can I see him?" "Yes," he stepped aside. "Please." She walked past him without another word. Theo was in the sitting room with a child welfare officer when Simone appeared in the doorway. He looked up, and whatever had been wound tight in him since 11:49 a.m., since the moment Conrad's hand had closed around his and led him toward the gate, came loose all at once. "Moni!" She crossed the room in 4 steps and gathered him into her arms, and he pressed his face into her neck and held her elephant tight, and she closed her eyes and breathed him in and said, very quietly, "I've got you. I've got you. You're okay. I've got you." Callum stood in the hallway outside the sitting room door. He did not go in. He stood with his shoulder against the wall and his head tilted back, and listened to his son cry in the arms of the person he had just put in handcuffs. It is one thing to be wrong. It is another to see, with perfect clarity, the full cost of it. He paid every cent of that cost in that hallway. In the days that followed, the story became public. The full story, not the version that had named Simone. The footage was reviewed by 3 independent sources. The messages between Petra and Conrad were verified. The custody proceedings were halted and redirected. Petra's legal team collapsed within a week. Conrad cooperated in exchange for reduced charges and provided testimony that confirmed every detail of the scheme. News sites that had published Simone's name issued retractions. Some sent emails. Some said nothing at all, which is the particular silence of institutions that know they cause damage and would prefer it when unacknowledged. Simone hired a single attorney, a quiet woman who had spent 20 years defending people who could not defend themselves, and sent a brief letter to each outlet that had published her photograph. The letter did not demand. It documented, and it was devastating in its restraint. Callum contacted her personally once, in writing, because he knew she would not take his calls. The letter was long. She read it twice. She did not respond right away. What she was thinking in those days of not responding was not what you might expect. She was not thinking about the handcuffs, though they had left marks, not physical ones. She was not thinking about the headline, though she had read it with a stillness that terrified her own reflection. She was thinking about a little boy who had stood in a garden and named a bird to her in a whisper. A little boy who had said in the back of a stranger's car, when he finally woke, "I want Moni." Not "Where is my father?" Not "Where is my mother?" Moni. She wrote back on a Tuesday. The letter was 3 paragraphs. She did not offer forgiveness, not yet. She was honest enough with herself to know that forgiveness is not a decision. It is a process, and she was still somewhere in the middle of it. But she said that Theo's well-being mattered to her regardless of what had passed between his father and herself. She said that if there was a role she could play in supporting his stability through what came next, the legal proceedings, the transition, the long work of helping a child understand why his mother had done what she had done, she was willing to discuss it. She ended with one sentence. "What I gave to your son, I gave freely. No court case, no headline, and no pair of handcuffs will ever change what was real between us." Callum read that sentence 4 times. Then he called his attorney and asked what it would take, legally and contractually, to offer Simone Carter a permanent position. Not as a nanny. As Theo's official guardian, with full legal protections and documentation, for as long as Theo needed her. His attorney said it was unusual. Callum said, "I am aware." Simone took 3 weeks to decide. She spoke with her mother. She prayed. She sat with the question the way she had sat with Theo on that cold hallway floor in her first week, quietly, with patience, with the knowledge that some answers cannot be hurried. On a Friday, she accepted. Not because she had forgiven everything, but because the child had asked for her. And she had never once in her life failed a child who asked. 2 months later, on a Saturday morning that smelled of rain, Simone and Theo were in the kitchen. He was standing on his step stool. She was showing him how to hold a spatula. There was flour on his nose and concentration on his brow, and he was narrating each step with the seriousness of a head chef. From the doorway, Callum watched. He said nothing for a long moment. Then Theo looked up and said, "Daddy, Moni says you have to wait for the bubbles, same as before." And Callum said, "She's right." He walked to the kitchen table, pulled out a chair and sat down. "She usually is," he said. This time, no one laughed, but something happened in the room that was quieter and more durable than laughter. Something that felt, cautiously and imperfectly, like beginning again. "Thank you for staying until the very end. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of person you are, someone who values truth, even when it is painful, even when it arrives too late, even when it costs something." Every story on this channel exists to remind you that you are not alone in what you have felt, what you have survived, and what you have overcome. If this story moved you in any way, if something in it touched a place you recognize, leave a comment below. Your words matter more than you know, and if you would like to be here for the next story, the subscribe button is waiting quietly with no pressure, only an open door. Until next time, take care of your heart. Pride can protect a reputation, but it can destroy a family. Some wounds don't disappear just because someone says sorry. Think about that for a moment. If you were Simone, after everything that happened, the handcuffs, the headline, the humiliation, could you truly go back? Or would a part of you always wonder, was it really about Theo? Or did he just need someone to blame? I am reading every comment. If you think this was shocking, wait until you see what he did when he slapped the nanny, right in front of his own daughter. That story is on this channel. Watch it next.